Ron Allen, under the auspices of West Street Christian Church, saying welcome, Kalimera, to this part 14 in a series on the Gospel of Mark, considering how Mark's word, Mark's telling of the story of Jesus, correlated with the circumstances of his church, those circumstances being quite similar to the circumstances of the current pandemic. And I come tonight to the most important passage in the Gospel, the second most important passage in the Gospel of Mark, and one of the most important passages to our church, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, because it contains at its center the one thing that a person must be able to say in order to be a member of this church. We encounter Jesus traveling with his disciples in Mark 8, beginning with verse 27, along the road toward Caesarea Philippi. As almost every single time in the Gospel of Mark, this is not simply a geographical reference, but has symbolic overtones. Caesarea, Caesar, Philippi, Philip, was a town that the Caesar named Philip had erected as a symbol of his dominance, rule over Palestine, as a symbol of the Roman imperial empire being the ultimate authority in that area. So what happens on this road places Jesus in direct opposition to this claim of Caesar's, though what is said in our passage takes the rulership of Jesus in a dramatically different way, but making no mistake that when push comes to shove, Jesus, the values and practices of the realm of God, which Jesus represents, are superior to those of Caesar. While they are traveling along, Jesus asks them, "Who do the people say that I am?" And some say, John the Baptist, others, one of the prophets. And he asked them directly, and we don't know, but I think of this as one of the most dramatic moments in the Bible when Jesus turns and looks them right in the eye and says, "But who do you, people who have been following me for 7.5 chapters, who do you say that I am?" And Peter replies straight out, "You are the Messiah," or as I prefer still, the King James, "Thou art the Christ." It's a little different in Luke. People, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter says, "You are the Christ of God." The most familiar to we disciples is in the Gospel of Matthew, where Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." But here in Mark, it's just, "You are the Christ," Christ being, in this way of thinking, God's representative who is leading the way in the transformation from the broken old to the coming fulsome new. Then, Mark says, he began to teach them many things, and this is where the rulership of Jesus begins to contrast most dramatically with that of Caesar. He began to teach that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day rise again. And he said all this quite openly. You see, Mark's church had this problem. They were announcing Jesus, and they were announcing his announcement, which is that the realm of God is at hand, and yet he had been crucified. And while it was easy to believe that, it was harder for people outside of Jesus' circle to believe that he had been raised from the dead. And so the question came up in circles around Mark's church, how can you take this seriously? How can you believe that Jesus is the agent of the great transformation when he was put to death in the most ignominious way on a cross? And telling the story this way is Mark's way of saying from the beginning, Jesus knew what would happen, and what happened to him reveals God's way of working in the world. It is not just to flex up your muscles and mow down your enemies. That's what Caesar does. It is to go underneath the values and practices of the current age and offer an alternative, a life-giving, life-empowering alternative that cannot be turned back. So immediately, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Sometimes we have a hard time believing in Jesus. Sometimes we have a hard time believing that what he says is really life-giving. Sometimes we have a hard time being ready to put into practice the things that he teaches. And this is Mark's way, reporting Peter in this way. This is Mark's way of saying, we are not the first to struggle. Here they are in the very presence of Jesus, and Peter doesn't quite get it. We learn from other passages in the Gospel of Mark that Peter, James, and John and the other disciples expected Jesus to be a Caesar greater than Caesar. Here, Jesus says, my ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. I am following a path of suffering love. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if any would become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their crosses and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they get in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous generation, of them, the Son of Man, Jesus, will be ashamed. Now, this pertains to our present moment in this way. Jesus says to them, if you want to become my follower, take up your cross. I am afraid we in the church have too often reduced the meaning of this saying to something like, don't have a second piece of chocolate cake, taking up your cross. But why did Jesus take up the cross? Because the powers of the old age confronted him, and they sought to extinguish him. He could have avoided death by renouncing the realm of God and pledging allegiance to Caesar. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the gospel and what happened in the wilderness in the temptation when Jesus was eyeball to eyeball with Satan. But he refused to give up on the possibility of transformation under the aegis of God. It was a love for God and a love for you and me that he would not deny himself and walk away from the cross. And this saying is Mark's way of warning his community. It's a pastoral warning. When you follow Jesus, you can expect others to misunderstand. You can expect others to resist. It may even cause you a certain kind of suffering. Not that your suffering is redemptive, it's not, but it is similar to the suffering of Jesus in that you have stood up to the principalities and powers, to the big Caesars and the little Caesars, and you have said no because you believe that beyond the immediate suffering, there is a life beyond imagination that will be a part of your life. And that's why he says those who want to save their life will lose it. Save your life in this immediate context means sign up with Caesar, partake of the values and practices of the Roman Empire, align yourself with what happens and the central figures of the old age. And if you do that, you will have comfort now, but at the time of the final transformation, you will lose it all. But if you lose your life for my sake, that is, if you stand up for the ways of the realm of God and lose aspects of your life or lose life itself, then from God's ultimate perspective, from the sense of your being aligned with the purposes of God, you will save your life. Indeed, what will it profit a person to gain the whole world in this old age, to have all the honors, all the resources, all the money, all the public attention? What will it gain a person to have all that and to lose their life? We are at a moment in our consideration of this pandemic when we have to decide whether we're going to align with the values and practices, the life-preserving values and practices of the realm of God, or consider options that may detract from that possibility. This passage does all it can to persuade us to say, I want to be a part of the renewal of the world as God will renew it, even if I have to place myself over and against some of the powers that be. While I might suffer something now, it is temporary and just a shadow, not even a shadow, of what God offers to those who are faithful, even as Jesus is continuing to be faithful.